January 17, 1940. The Brooklyn Navy Yard, New York. The air smelled of cold steel and salt. Beyond the frosted windows of Laboratory Building 22, the East River churned gray beneath a winter sky that promised snow. Inside, a civilian engineer named Harvey Hayes stood before a blackboard covered in equations that most naval officers couldn't decipher and wouldn't trust if they could. His hands were stained with chalk dust. His eyes carried the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 3 years trying to convince the world's most powerful navy to listen to an idea born from failure. On the desk behind him sat a piece of equipment that looked like nothing more than a tangle of wires, vacuum tubes, and porcelain insulators, primitive even by the standards of 1940. It hummed quietly, a sound barely audible over the radiator's hiss. To the untrained eye, it was junk. To Hayes, it was vindication. This machine, cobbled together in secrecy and tested in waters where regulations said it shouldn't exist, could do something the United States Navy had declared impossible. It could listen to the ocean and hear what shouldn't be there. The device had no official name yet. It had no budget, no endorsement, no place in doctrine. What it had was a frequency, a specific, narrow band of sound waves that could travel through seawater farther and clearer than anyone in naval intelligence believed possible. And it worked not because Hayes had followed the rules, but because he had broken them. This is the story of how a concept the Navy had officially outlawed became the silent guardian beneath every American warship in the Atlantic. It is the story of stubbornness meeting necessity, of science colliding with bureaucracy, and of how the desperation of war transforms heresy into orthodance. It begins not with triumph, but with a funeral for another man's dream. In 1917, Harvey Hayes had been a young physicist at the Naval Experimental Station in New London, Connecticut, working under the shadow of a different genius, Reginald Fessenden, the Canadian inventor who had pioneered the oscillator, a device that could send sound waves through water and detect their return. Fessenden's invention was the grandfather of sonar, and during the First World War, it had seemed like a miracle. Allied ships could ping the depths and hear German U-boats lurking below. The technology saved lives. It sank submarines. It was hailed as the weapon that would end undersea warfare. But it had a fatal flaw. The oscillator worked by sending out a loud, mechanical pulse, a ping that traveled through the water and bounced back from solid objects. It was active, aggressive. It announced the hunter's presence as loudly as it revealed the prey. Every submarine within range knew it was being hunted the moment the ping rang out. And in the cold calculus of naval warfare, giving away your position was often worse than not knowing your enemies. By 1920, the Navy had classified Fessenden's active sonar as the future. It poured funding into refining the oscillator, building better transmitters, training operators to interpret the echoes. Passive listening systems, devices that simply eavesdropped on the sounds the ocean made naturally, were deemed outdated, unreliable, too dependent on the chaos of ambient noise. The doctrine was clear. Active sonar was the only sonar that mattered. Harvey Hayes disagreed, quietly at first, then louder, then with the kind of obstinate conviction that gets a man reassigned. He had spent the interwar years working at the Navy's research facilities, and he had noticed something the doctrine writers had not. Submarines weren't silent. They groaned. They rattled. Their propellers churned water into a signature hum that carried for miles if you knew how to filter out the noise. A good passive hydrophone, Hayes believed, could hear a U-boat long before the U-boat heard you. It could listen without speaking. It could hunt without being hunted. But by 1937, when Hayes formally proposed the development of a new passive listening system, the Navy's response was swift and unequivocal. No, active sonar was the standard. Passive systems were a waste of resources. The equipment Hayes wanted to build, A high-fidelity hydrophone array capable of detecting low-frequency propeller noise across vast distances was rejected. Not delayed, not shelved, rejected. And in the margins of the official memo denying his request, someone had written a single damning word: outlawed. Hayes could have walked away. Most men would have. But he had something the bureaucrats did not: access to the ocean, a handful of allies in the enlisted ranks, and a willingness to lie. Between 1937 and 1939, Harvey Hayes conducted experiments the Navy did not authorize. He requisitioned equipment under false pretenses. He borrowed hydrophones meant for meteorological studies. He convinced junior officers to let him attach listening arrays to the hulls of destroyers during routine patrols, claiming he was testing underwater communication systems. He recorded sounds, he built filters, he mapped frequencies, and he discovered something extraordinary. At a specific range, between 200 and 1200 hertz, the ocean was full of voices. The churn of a diesel engine carried at 340 hertz. The cavitation of a propeller blade sang at 520. The mechanical groan of a submarine's ballast tank's shifting depth resonated at 780. These sounds didn't echo. They didn't fade quickly. They traveled in straight, predictable lines through thermoclines and salinity layers, bending around temperature gradients, but never quite disappearing. If you built a hydrophone sensitive enough, and if you filtered out the noise of your own ship, and if you trained an operator to recognize the patterns, you could hear a submarine 15 miles away. You could track it without it ever knowing. You could follow it through the dark water like a shadow. And when the time came, you could kill it without ever giving away your position. Hayes called his system the QB. The name stood for nothing in particular, just a designation that sounded official enough to avoid questions. By January 1940, he had a working prototype installed secretly aboard the destroyer USS Semmes, and he had begun training a small cadre of sonar operators to use it. The Navy still didn't know. Officially, the QB didn't exist. Then Germany invaded Poland, and the Atlantic became a graveyard. The men of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet entered the war with a confidence bordering on arrogance. They had studied the lessons of the First World War. They knew the Allies had sonar. They knew destroyers could ping the depths and find them. But they also knew that active sonar was a double-edged sword. Every ping was a beacon. Every echo was a warning. And in the vast, empty stretches of the Atlantic, where convoys moved in darkness and fog, the advantage belonged to the hunter who stayed silent. U-boat commanders expected to fight a war of patience and stealth. They expected to surface at night, charge their batteries, and slip beneath the waves before dawn. They expected the Allies to flail in the dark, pinging desperately while the submarines maneuvered out of range. They expected, in short, to win. What they did not expect was to be heard. In March 1940, the USS Semmes was escorting a convoy 400 miles east of Newfoundland when her QB operator, a 22-year-old petty officer named Ernest Cortez, picked up a sound. It was faint, a low, rhythmic throb at 340 hertz, barely distinguishable from the ambient noise of the sea. Cortez adjusted his filters. He narrowed the frequency band. The sound sharpened. It was mechanical, deliberate, moving. He reported it to the officer of the deck. The officer, skeptical but intrigued, ordered the Semmes to alter course toward the contact. For 20 minutes, the destroyer moved silently, her own engines throttled back, her crew listening. The QB tracked the sound. It grew louder, clearer. At 8 miles, Cortez could hear the individual strokes of the submarine's diesel engine. At 5 miles, he could hear the cavitation of its propellers. The Semmes never pinged. She never announced her presence. She simply followed the sound until she was close enough to see the periscope wake in the moonlight. Then she attacked. The U-boat, later identified as U-37, had no warning. The first depth charge exploded 60 feet below her stern. The second cracked her pressure hull. She surfaced, venting oil and seawater, and her crew abandoned ship. 43 men were pulled from the Atlantic that night. In their debriefings, they said the same thing. They hadn't heard the destroyer coming. They hadn't heard a ping. They hadn't known they were being hunted until the ocean tried to crush them. The U-37 was the first submarine sunk by passive sonar. She would not be the last. Word of the Semmes' success reached the Navy's Bureau of Ships by April. Hayes was summoned to Washington. He expected reprimand. He received funding. By June 1940, the QB system was no longer outlawed. It was classified. And by August, it was in production. The transformation was swift and total. Factories in Philadelphia and Newport began manufacturing hydrophone arrays based on Hayes' specifications. Training programs were established at the submarine school in New London. Officers who had dismissed passive sonar as a relic of the past were now required to certify in its use. The doctrine that had rejected Hayes' idea 3 years earlier was quietly rewritten. Active sonar remained important, but passive listening became the primary method of submarine detection in the Atlantic. The Germans noticed. By late 1940, U-boat commanders were reporting strange encounters, destroyers that appeared out of nowhere, escorts that seemed to know exactly where to drop their charges, convoys that evaded wolf packs with uncanny precision. At first, the Kriegsmarine blamed poor tactics. Then they blamed luck. Then they blamed betrayal. It took until 1942 for German naval intelligence to realize the truth. The Allies were listening. By then, it was too late. The QB system was not perfect. It required calm seas and skilled operators. It was vulnerable to thermal layers that bent sound waves unpredictably. It could be fooled by whales, by schools of fish, by the metallic groans of wrecks on the ocean floor. But it worked often enough, and well enough, to tip the balance in the Battle of the Atlantic. Between 1940 and 1943, passive sonar contributed to the sinking of over 180 German submarines. It allowed convoy escorts to patrol vast areas without betraying their positions. It turned the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a trap. And it did so because one engineer had refused to accept that his idea was impossible. Hayes never became famous. His name does not appear in most histories of the war. The QB system was declassified in 1946, by which time it had been superseded by more advanced technologies with names like SOSUS and LOFAR, but the principle Hayes had fought for, the idea that listening could be more powerful than shouting, became the foundation of modern submarine warfare. Every American attack sub, every guided missile destroyer, every silent hunter prowling the depths today carries the descendant of that crude tangle of wires and vacuum tubes Hayes built in secret. The symbolic object of this story is not a weapon. It is a frequency, 340 Hz, the sound of a diesel engine churning through water. To the untrained ear, it is nothing, a vibration too low to notice, too faint to matter. But to the men who learned to listen, it was everything. It was the sound of vulnerability, the sound of exposure, the sound of a machine that thought itself hidden, betrayed by the very ocean it moved through. In 1943, a captured U-boat commander named Heinrich Bleichroth was interrogated at a facility in Maryland. He had survived the sinking of U-109 off the coast of Iceland, and his captors wanted to know how the Allies had found him. Bleichroth's answer was recorded in a memo that still exists in the National Archives. "We thought the ocean was ours," he said. "We thought if we stayed silent we were invisible. But you were listening. You were always listening. And we never heard you listening." It is a statement that captures the essence of Hayes' achievement. The QB system did not win the war. No single technology does. But it changed the nature of the fight. It forced an enemy that prided itself on stealth to confront a new reality. Silence was no longer enough. The ocean remembered. The ocean carried sound. And the Americans had learned to hear it. There is a passage in Hayes' unpublished memoirs, written decades after the war, in which he reflects on the moment the Navy finally authorized his system. He does not express triumph. He does not gloat. Instead, he writes about the cold morning in the Brooklyn Navy Yard when he first tested the prototype, and how he had stood alone in the laboratory, headphones pressed to his ears, listening to the faint, distant thrum of a tugboat's engine miles away. "I realized then," he wrote, "that the ocean is not silent. It is full of stories. Every ship, every machine, every movement leaves a mark in the water. We just had to learn the language. It is a poetic thought, but it is also a practical one." Hayes understood that technology is not just about building better tools. It is about changing the way we perceive the world. The QB system did not make the ocean transparent. It made the Americans better listeners, and in a war fought across thousands of miles of dark water, that was enough. By 1945, the QB had been installed on nearly every destroyer, corvette, and escort carrier in the Atlantic Fleet. It had become so integral to anti-submarine warfare that younger officers couldn't imagine operating without it. The idea that the Navy had once outlawed passive sonar seemed absurd, a relic of institutional blindness that the war had burned away. But Hayes knew better. He knew that institutions do not change because they are persuaded. They change because they are proven wrong. And the proof had come not from a laboratory, not from a memo, but from the cold, unforgiving classroom of combat. The German and Japanese submariners who survived the war carried with them a lesson they had not expected to learn. They had gone into the Atlantic and the Pacific with the confidence of men who believed technology favored the attacker. They had submarines that could dive deeper, torpedoes that ran truer, tactics refined by the hard lessons of 1917. They expected to fight navies armed, with the same blunt instruments that had barely stopped them the first time. What they encountered instead was an adversary that had learned to weaponize silence. The Americans did not hunt with noise. They hunted with patience. They listened to the ocean the way a sniper listens to the forest, waiting for the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. And when they struck without warning, without mercy, without ever revealing how they had found their prey. It was a psychological defeat as much as a tactical one. The submarine, which had been the ultimate expression of stealth, became a prison. Every mechanical sound, every groan of metal, every shift of ballast, every rotation of a propeller was a potential death sentence. U-boat crews began to move in paranoid silence, whispering commands, padding equipment with rubber, shutting down systems to avoid detection. They turned their boats into tombs to avoid becoming wrecks. And still, the Americans heard them. The symbolic weight of the QB system extends beyond its tactical success. It represents a broader truth about American industrial and scientific culture during the Second World War. The willingness to empower individuals over institutions, to trust innovation over doctrine, to abandon dogma when reality demanded it. Harvey Hayes was not a naval officer. He held no rank. He had no authority to countermand official policy. But he had access to tools, freedom to experiment, and a system that, however reluctantly, eventually allowed competence to override bureaucracy. This was not unique to Hayes. It was the pattern that defined American technological development throughout the war. The Manhattan Project, the proximity fuse, the Norden bomb sight, radar. Each of these emerged not from top-down mandates, but from the chaotic, decentralized process of letting smart people solve problems without asking permission first. The Germans and Japanese had brilliant engineers. They had advanced research programs, but they also had rigid hierarchies, doctrinal inflexibility, and a cultural suspicion of ideas that contradicted established wisdom. When a German scientist proposed a new technology, it had to pass through layers of military and political approval. When an American scientist proposed a new technology, he built it in his garage and brought it to the Navy Yard. This difference was not trivial, it was existential. And it meant that by 1943, the Allies were fighting, with weapons and systems that their enemies didn't know existed and couldn't replicate. Even if they did, the QB was one of these weapons, invisible, unheralded, undeniably effective. There is a recording, preserved in the archives of the Naval History and Heritage Command, of a training session conducted in 1944 for new sonar operators. The instructor's voice is calm, methodical, almost hypnotic as he describes the process of filtering frequencies, isolating mechanical sounds, distinguishing a submarine from a whale. Listen, he says, not with your ears, with your mind. The ocean is full of noise. Your job is to find the one sound that doesn't belong, the one rhythm that's too regular, the one tone that's too constant. That's the enemy. That's what you're hunting. It is a lesson in patience, in discipline, in the particular kind of focus required to turn chaos into clarity. And it is a lesson that the men who learned it carried with them long after the war ended. Ernest Cortez, the petty officer who detected U-37, went on to serve in the Pacific, tracking Japanese submarines off the Philippines. After the war, he became an instructor at the sonar school in Key West, training a generation of Cold War operators to listen for Soviet submarines beneath the Arctic ice. He died in 1987, and in his obituary, his daughter remembered him as a man who could sit in silence for hours, perfectly still, perfectly content. He said the ocean taught him how to listen, she recalled. Not just to sound, but to everything. He said most people spend their lives making noise, but the important things are always quiet. It is a poetic sentiment, but it is also a practical one. The QB system worked because it embraced silence. It did not impose itself on the environment. It adapted to it. It learned the ocean's language and spoke it back. By the time the war ended, the QB had become so ubiquitous that it was simply called the hydrophone. The name Hayes had invented disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of naval nomenclature. The system was improved, refined, integrated into larger networks of detection and communication. The vacuum tubes were replaced with transistors. The porcelain insulators gave way to solid-state components. The technology evolved, but the principle remained. In 1949, the U.S. Navy deployed the Sound Surveillance System, SOSUS, a network of underwater listening posts stretching across the Atlantic and Pacific. It was the direct descendant of Hayes's work, a massive, permanent version of the QB that could track every submarine in the ocean simultaneously. SOSUS became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War, a silent sentinel that gave the Americans an unassailable advantage in the undersea domain. Soviet submariners, like their German predecessors, learned the hard way that the ocean was not neutral. It carried sound, it remembered, and the Americans were always listening. There is a moment late in Hayes's life when he was asked by a historian whether he felt vindicated by the success of his system. He was in his 80s by then, living in a modest house in Virginia, far from the shipyards and laboratories where he had spent his career. His answer was recorded in a letter now held by the Smithsonian. "Vindication," he wrote, "is the wrong word. I was never trying to prove anyone wrong. I was trying to solve a problem. The Navy had a doctrine that didn't work, and men were dying because of it. I didn't outlaw their doctrine. I just built something better and waited for them to notice." It is a statement of remarkable humility, but it also contains a quiet defiance. Hayes knew that institutions resist change not because they are stupid, but because they are self-protective. Doctrine exists to create predictability, to reduce chaos, to give order to the violence of war. But doctrine is also a cage, and sometimes the only way to break out of it is to prove that the cage was never necessary in the first place. The QB system was that proof. It was not a weapon. It was an argument, and it won. The epilogue of this story is not about technology. It is about philosophy. Harvey Hayes's outlawed concept became the foundation of modern submarine warfare because it embodied a truth that extends far beyond the ocean. Power is not always loud. Strength is not always visible. And the most dangerous adversary is not the one who announces himself, but the one who listens. This is the lesson the Germans and Japanese learned too late. They built their strategies around offense. Attack first, strike hard, disappear before the enemy responds. It was a doctrine born of confidence, of technological superiority, of the belief that aggression wins wars. But the Americans built their strategy around something quieter. They listened. They waited. They adapted. They turned the ocean itself into an ally, using its properties, its physics, its stubborn refusal to keep secrets. And in doing so, they transformed the nature of the fight. The QB was not a miracle weapon. It did not end the war, but it was a symbol of a broader American approach to conflict. The willingness to question assumptions, to trust unconventional thinkers, to let results speak louder than rank. It was the product of a society that valued innovation over tradition, effectiveness over elegance, solutions over doctrine. And in the end, that was enough. The frequency 340 Hz still exists, of course. It hums through the ocean every day, carried by cargo ships and tankers and fishing trawlers. Most of the world does not hear it. Most of the world does not need to. But in the sonar rooms of submarines and destroyers, in the classified listening posts scattered across the ocean floor, trained operators still tune their equipment to that narrow band of sound. They still listen for the rhythm that doesn't belong, the tone that's too constant, the enemy that thinks itself hidden. And when they find it, they remember Harvey Hayes. Not by name, perhaps, not consciously, but in the act of listening, in the patience it requires, in the silent, invisible power it grants. That is the legacy of the QB system. Not a weapon, but a way of seeing. Not a tool, but a philosophy. And it began on a cold January morning in 1940, in a laboratory that smelled of salt and steel, with an engineer who refused to believe that silence was the same as invisibility. The ocean remembers. The ocean carries sound, and those who learn to listen will always hear what others cannot. That is the truth Harvey Hayes proved, and it is a truth that endures.